Hello, everybody. Is everybody in and sitting, suitably distanced? Very nice to see you all, or nearly see you all. I can't quite see you. My name is Liz Calder, and it was my enormous privilege and pleasure to publish Anna's wonderful book, The Tulip, in 1999. That was this copy, which some of you may have already. It was one of the joyous privileges of my life as a publisher, and it just filled the whole company at Bloomsbury with delight when we discovered and read the book and met Anna. And in fact, she tells me we actually sold as many as 10,000 copies even before publication. Before Christmas, that same year. It was supposed to be published the following year, year 2000. Anyway, it has been a very, very special book in my life, and probably in your life, Anna. So yes, the new edition, which is on sale, and while you'll have to pick deeply into your pockets for it, it's worth it. It's something that will become a family heirloom for sure. And it's a treat both to read and to see the most beautiful illustrations. Anna is going to do a talk, and that will be followed by a conversation with Catherine Larner, who is our wonderful interlocutor, and will be then any questions that you may have. So thank you very much for coming. Anna, thank you very much for coming, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Liz. The great thing is not to fall over. I have rather sad memories of falling off stages in the past, and I'm always quite nervous till I get to my speaking situation. I'm safely here. It's very, very good of you to come. I think we all feel we're at a very strange cusp. I certainly feel it. I was unwontedly nervous, not about the COVID thing, but just about the process of standing up in front of people and talking. You know, for 18 months I haven't done this, and it's become so much part of one's life as a writer, you know, to get out to literary festivals and talk. So my thanks to you for coming and showing that there still is a sort of not exactly a need, I wouldn't go as far as that to say, but that you still think that it's quite a good thing to actually go and hear live somebody standing up and talking about something that they love. And I can't tell you how much I owe to Liz, because in fact the entire book was written without a publisher. I did not think it would be a book. It was an obsession. It was something that fascinated me. I worked on it for 6 or 7 years until finally I made this manuscript. I pasted 126 pictures into it and said, put it in a box and said, well, that was very interesting. And actually it was my agent who rather grudgingly thought he might have a look at it. And the day that we actually went out to meet publishers, he chose 3 to show it to. And I walked into the boardroom at Bloomsbury, and there, sitting on the boardroom table, was that front cover, which became an iconic cover. And they'd made it even for the presentation. They didn't even know they were going to get the book. But of course they got the book. Of course they did. I won't tell you who the other publishers were. But anyway, it was the most fantastic adventure. And I have a great deal to thank Liz for, including my first ever journey to America. We had 2 author tours in America, again, unheard of. So all sorts of things happened because Liz brought them about. So I'm just now going to give you a very quick talk about Tulip before Catherine starts asking me some questions, and perhaps there'll be some questions that you want to ask too. Now, it's not a gardening talk. It's actually a talk about the tulip, and the things that I wrote about were about its history, its past, its provenance in the wild. And tulipomania, of course, is supposed to have ended with that great crash in Amsterdam in 1637 when the state moved in to bring to an end the wildest period of trading in any commodity the world had ever known. You might almost say that the tulip invented the stock market. But of course they're wrong, because why would I be standing here talking to you about the tulip if that obsession wasn't still alive and very much with us? And the amounts of tulips now that you see in these great public displays, it's quite extraordinary. There has been a wave of delight in these extraordinary flowers, and that is not surprising. We are looking at the sexiest, the most capricious, the most various, the most subtle, the most powerful and intriguing flower that has ever grown on earth. And this is one of the many engravings that an extraordinary artist, Crispin de Passe, published in his book, The Hortus Floridus of 1614, in effect, the first nursery catalogue. Now, it started for me by a sort of recognition within myself that I was haunting places where tulips were to be found. The Cambridge Botanic Garden first, who had then the only collection of tulip species that existed in this country. Then I found myself looking for pictures of these wonderful things, drawings, prints, engravings, anything that I could lay my hands on to keep me in touch with the flower through those long tulipless months from the beginning of June right the way through to the following February. This is Jan van Huysum and a beautiful print from the British Museum. After that, I began actually to look for a book that would answer all the questions I was beginning to ask. And the extraordinary thing was that this book did not exist. We are not a country in which there is a shortage of books on most subjects you can think of, but there was no book that actually told me about the tulip. So I thought, that's interesting. And what I first felt I needed to do was to get out into the wild and look for what nature had provided, as it were, as the building blocks of the tulips that we now grow in our gardens. And the first one that I ever went in search of was a little tulip called Tulipa bakeri. It's this one, not a wild, outrageous tulip such as grows in the Crimea, actually rather a chaste, beautiful thing in chaparelli pink with that gorgeous yellow blotch at the bottom, called bakeri after the man George Percival Baker, who first showed it at the Royal Horticultural Society in 1895. So, we found a lot of good tulips in Crete, which was where Baker had first found it and where I decided we had to go in Baker's footsteps. And we found lovely sheets of a tulip called Hageri. Now, what was wrong with Hageri? Nothing, but I'd set my heart on bakeri. I had this image of that lovely print in my mind. That's what I wanted. Several botanists have reported finding it near a high town called Omelos, a rather bleak plain, if you know Crete, with high mountains all round. And I courted that plain like a bloodhound, and I found anemones and all sorts of lovely things, not satisfied. I started climbing up the side of the mountain. I even actually got up to the snow line, where these gorgeous little crocus seberi were growing. No tulips, of course not. They don't grow on snow lines, and I knew that. So I chucked a snowball at an eagle and very crossly stomped on back down to the plain, where my husband, who'd seen the way things were going, had actually just got the picnic out and was leaning up against a rock, feeding himself out of the picnic basket. And as I got up to him, he pointed down to the ground and he said, "Is this what you were looking for?" Now, a good man, a really good man, but he doesn't know a tulip from a tiger lily, and yet this thing had chosen to reveal itself to him. There was a good lesson learned. You do not go out looking for tulips in that mood of hunter-gatherer. You do not. You treat it with respect. You approach it with reverence. And that's what I learned on that trip. But of course, once I had a chance really to look at it, I did have that reverence for this thing. And I sort of felt that I knew how Galahad must have felt when he caught up with his Holy Grail. Here was my grail, the first tulip species that I had seen growing in the wild. But as in any love affair after that initial coup de foudre, what you want to do is to actually understand a little bit more about the object of your passion. And the tulip doesn't disappoint, because its background is full of these extraordinary dramas and dilemmas and disasters, just amazing history. And so it was an amazing 6-7 years that I followed this flower and made notes and gradually put together this thing, which was a book in the sense that it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not a book in the sense that I ever thought that it would be published. But You need to think yourself on a map to the line the 40 degrees north of the equator. And then you travel along a corridor where most wild tulips grow, and that stretches from Ankara in Turkey and goes eastwards through Yerevan, through Baku, through Turkmenistan, past Bokhara, wonderful romantic names, Samarkand, Tashkent, to the mountains of the Pamir Alai. And that, together with the neighbouring range of Tian Shan, is the cradle of the tulip family. If you ask people, they'll say, or if you ask them where the tulip comes from, most people will say Holland, because of course the Dutch have made themselves such brilliant marketeers of this flower. But nature placed them in this particular place, right along that 40-degree line of latitude, in those wonderful mountains. But as far as Western Europe is concerned, the tulip story began in Turkey, much closer to us, from where in the mid-16th century travellers brought back news of these absolutely brilliant, and until then unknown in Europe, l'île rouge. That's what Westerners called them. They thought they were a sort of lily, l'île rouge, so prized by the Turks. But of course they weren't lilies at all. Now, in April, this man, who had actually not knowledge of tulips in the wild, but he was a wonderful botanist called Gesner. And he saw the tulip flowering for the first time in the garden of an Augsburg silver merchant, which tells you that these were highly prized treasures, these bulbs that arrived in consignments from the East, and only the people like the silversmiths of Augsburg could actually afford them. And he published the first illustration and description of this wild tulip, the first one that's actually known to exist in Western Europe. Here is Gesner's own painting, noting the characteristics of this flower, the flip at the top of the petals, the gleaming red, the shininess, the sheen like satin, and also the scent, which is not something that one automatically associates with tulip, and not with red ones, but gardeners know that actually the orange ones often carry a wonderful primrose-like scent, which is much to be treasured. So this was the man who actually wrote the first description and published the first picture of this new flower. And from that flower, and from its cousins, gathered over the next 300 years, came those cultivars which we now grow in our gardens with such incredible delight. Early flowered, lily-flowered ballerina, the lily-flowered Maytime, Princess Irene, and the Darwin tulip Banjaluka, and this wonderful old one, which is the pink, I'm losing my place. Sorry, that one's Banjaluka, and then I can't see them, that's my problem. And then we have Halcro growing with wild fennel, which is the sort of thing that it will grow with on those Turkish mountains. White Triumphata growing with Murus odorata, and the magnificent Magier, which actually comes out the colour of clotted cream, and then as it ages, which it does, exquisitely, a tiny purple edging to its petals, then fades and leaches into the cream, and it dies a completely different creature to the one that it was born as. Now, it can't ever have been an English wildflower. No tulips actually exist among the flowered borders of all those gorgeous decorated manuscripts or on tapestries such as this. But the first picture that I was ever able to track down, actually in an artwork, as apart from Gesner's botanical drawing, was a very strange miniature called A Young Daughter of the Picts. Now, no Pictish girl would have known anything about tulips, but look at those marvellous flowers, tattooed all over her body. She stands there, chillily naked, but with these wonderful tattooed flowers all over her body. Now, once introduced, of course, it created complete havoc. And that is the one thing that people know about the tulip, that actually it created tulip mania. Holland was the setting. Holland, where you think that people are so, sensible. And yet Holland had this extraordinary mania for tulips. Now, it's a puzzling thing, and people have never quite got to the reason of why it happened there, but certainly there was a great deal of money in Holland at that time because of the Dutch East India Company, which had been recently set up. And that timing actually was quite important. The Dutch East India Company, 1602 was the year it was actually set up, and then by the 1630s you had this mania actually really driving the most extraordinary trade in this flower. Adrian de Pauw was one of the directors of the new East India Company, and his house just outside Haarlem had all the accoutrements that a rich man would have. And in his garden he had amazing tulips such as this Bestre Bruin clustered round mirrored gazebos, because even he, such a rich man, couldn't actually get hold of the number of bulbs that he wanted. So he planted them in these circles round these mirrors so that people walking into the garden would see the reflections and think he'd got more tulips than he really had. It was the ultimate status symbol. And among the many rare tulips that people like de Pauw had was actually the entire known stock of this extraordinary broken tulip called Semper Augustus. Semper Augustus, even at the height of people who were trying to breed it and bring it on and bulk up the stock, only 12 tulips of this kind were ever known. And that's actually because of something inherent in the bulb that produced these wonderful broken effects. Growers soon found the most extraordinary trick was built into some tulips, but they could not predict which. You could plant a plain-coloured tulip in the autumn, like this purple one, and the next spring it might bounce out broken in this extraordinary way. And it was these broken flowers that actually were the source of the extraordinary gambling. This was the gamble. Had you got a tulip that was going to break like this? But the problem was, of course, that nobody knew what caused these breaks. And it wasn't until the 1920s that actually at the John Innes Research Institute, the whole extraordinary story was unravelled, and it was caused, it seemed, by a virus. We've all seen green fly, black fly, all sorts of aphids feeding on our tulips in spring, and every now and again they will inject into the stem this virus which travels down the stem, lodges in the bulb, but only shows its effect the following season. And then you'll get this break, this extraordinary break. But the virus in plants, as with us, has a weakening effect. So that beautiful broken bulb that produced this flower, that would always go on producing that flower, but it could not get the strength to produce an offset. And it was that vegetative propagation which was the only way to increase the stock. They couldn't do anything about that, about increasing the way that actually this tulip could be bulked up and made more available to a market that was absolutely longing for it. But they never got to the bottom of that mystery. And as I say, it was Dorothy Cayley, a woman working at the John Innes Research Institute in the 1920s, who unpicked the whole thing. And it wasn't surprising. The word virus didn't come into our language until the beginning of the 21st century. So it was an unimaginable mystery at a time when, of course, alchemy was very much in the air. Now, those who couldn't afford the tulips themselves, actually, here's a tulip fancier, actually horrified at a butterfly fancier trampling all over his bed. But those who couldn't actually afford the bulbs themselves commissioned artists to paint them. And so something by Jan van Huysum, like this great flower piece, would cost about 5,000 guilders at the time. But at the great auction of tulip bulbs in Alkmaar, 5th of February 1637, a single bulb of the tulip Admiral Liefkens, this is a list of the prices, cost 4,800 guilders, just the one bulb. So you see, it was actually much cheaper to go and get Van Huysum to paint the things than it was to acquire the real bulbs for your garden. Such an extraordinary switchover now, of course. Well, tulips are staggeringly cheap, and who among us could ever dream of actually owning one of the great paintings of the Golden Age?
But then there was a great change in gardening taste. It's always going on, and if you're interested in garden history as I am, you will see it happening underneath your very nose. The landscape style of Capability Brown began to be much more important than those beautiful neat little parterres in which the tulips were planted here and in Italy and in France. And it was rescued from the dung heap by a completely different type of grower who was growing a completely different type of tulip called the English Florist tulip. Now, these florists were, at the beginning at least, predominantly northerners, men such as Ben Simonite, a great hero of mine, Sheffield, he was a cutler, he was a greyhound fancier, Tom Storer of Derby, who was a railwayman, and he didn't have a garden, but he grew his tulips along the railway embankments, and Sam Barlow, whose life as apprentice, manager, and finally proprietor of the Stakehill Bleach Works at Castleton near Manchester could have furnished an entire Arnold Bennett novel. They would all have described themselves as florists, using the word in its original sense, people who chose to grow one particular flower, in this case the tulip, who showed it in sometimes viciously contested competitions, and who actually kept the beauty of this flower going through unchanged blood, as prized as the blood of any racehorse, as far as I'm concerned, all the way through that time from the first introduction. Now, of the hundreds of tulip societies that once existed in the land, only one now exists, and that's the Wakefield Tulip Society in Yorkshire, of which I'm extremely proud to be a vice president. And every year, if you go up there, you will find these magnificent tulips grown in competition, still using the beer bottles that have always been used at the Wakefield Tulip Society. Yorkshiremen, why not? Free. They mostly had their shows in the early days in pubs, and actually nothing better could be chosen for these exquisite flowers than a good old beer bottle at the bottom of it. And so every May, you get these extraordinary blooms being shown. But these English florists, although uncompromising, particularly the Yorkshire ones, were no less choosy than the Turkish ones. 300 years before any attempt was made to list the sorts of tulips we had, the Turkish florists were already settling amongst themselves which ones were worth growing and which weren't. The Turks liked a completely different sort of flower, which we see on the wonderful tile work in their mosques if we go, or used to go, to Constantinople. The ones that they liked, what they called a needle flower, some that had a sort of needle point, a dagger shape. Those were the sorts of tulips that they liked. You could almost prick your finger on the tip of the flower that they thought best. And so, of course, we had to go to Turkey to look for those 14 species that grew there that actually, again, were the beginning of what those Turkish florists bred at the courts in Constantinople. And I was particularly looking, of course, over in eastern Turkey. I was travelling with my husband, with Christopher Lloyd, and his magnificent head gardener, Fergus Garrett, who, of course, is still looking after that great garden at Great Dixter. And it was the height of the problems with the Kurdish guerrillas, the PKK. And we'd been given very good advice, and we ricocheted between one sort of stoppage with the Turkish army and another, the endless machine gun sort of halts, and machine guns poked in through the windows of the car. But we'd been given such good advice, and we weren't stopped. We were just thought to be completely mad. But I would never, ever forget that trip. Christopher was magnificent, never turned a hair at the machine guns, just gazed around him saying, "Look at that wonderful iris." And of course, you were slightly concentrating on the trigger finger, but there we are. Here we all are to tell the tale. But the loveliest colonies of tulips we found were in a lovely valley above Taunton, a university town, a fine place. And there you find these tulips, little wild tulips growing. This is Tulipa armina as the botanists describe it. Once you're out in the field, you find, of course, it can do 100 different tricks, each one as lovely as the last. But they were intriguing, these changes, these different clothes that it was trying out for itself. And one day I was spread-eagled on a rock in this little valley above Taunton, thinking about Tulipa armina and the way that it was reinventing itself. And something made me open my eyes, and there, sitting on the rock just opposite me, quite close, was a wolf with its tail beautifully curled round its legs. And I sat up, which was a mistake, because the wolf bolted away. It was a real wolf and went into its cave underneath the rocks. And I thought, what a fantastic conjunction of creatures. That brilliant red tulip, that amazing wolf, both living together here in this tiny, isolated little valley, both of them knowing each other long before any man ever saw either of them. And also I thought about those tulips, now in full flower, but in their bulbs underneath the ground, plotting, thinking of new tricks that we as mere humans could never even begin to think of. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Do come and join me. Well, thank you so much. That was just fantastic. You're clearly as enthusiastic and as passionate as you ever were. Has that obsession diminished at all?
I think it changes. I think the thing about being a gardener is that you have this fantastic opportunity, if you're lucky, to actually move on and, perhaps experiment with all sorts of things you've never grown before. So I think probably if you're not actively involved in the research and the writing, as I was for all those years, you become more of a passive admirer. You aren't, you're intrigued, but there's nothing that actually then drives you in the way that it did during those 6 or 7 years. Yeah. I still adore them. I think something slightly sad has happened, that somehow garden visitors think, or some garden visitors think, that tulips have to exist in vast, great spreads, Pashley Manor and all those places where, they advertise 10,000 tulips in this. Yeah, that's okay. And that's actually what the Dutch did at the Paris exhibition at the end of the 1800s, the 1890s, to actually create a market in tulips. It's wonderful to be able to sell 10,000 of the same tulip all at once. But actually, it stops people looking at the magnificent complexity of the tulip. The wonderful thing about the tulip to me was not the fact that it was a red tulip, but you remember that slide of Tulipa armina, that black centre, that yellow circle round the black, the colour of the stamens, the colour of the pollen on the stamens. All these things are exquisitely different. And that's what I think we're losing. And what I've done is I grow very many less garden tulips than I ever used to, but I'm growing many more of the species. The species are brilliant because you find that they will settle in well-drained ground, and over here on the east you are in prime country, much more so than I am in West Dorset. But the species will settle and clump up, and that is something that as a gardener you think, it's happy enough to think it can stay. And that is something, which you feel so comfortable about in your garden, with things that you're not growing just because you want them, this selfish, thing of possessing, which unfortunately we do have. My daughter and I were talking about this morning, looking around her fantastic garden, and I was saying, the problem is we want to do the things that we know we shouldn't be doing, that just don't want to be with us here. They want to be somewhere else. And the lovely thing about the species is that they have so much more elastic in them than all the bred varieties, and you have plenty of time to look at that extraordinary flush, perhaps of purple on the outside of the orange petal, the wonderful shape of the petal. That's something that's almost completely lost in these great spreads. People don't think about the shape of the tulip, but they do vary enormously. And I particularly love the ones that, like the Turkish ones, come up to this extraordinary point, like Tulipa orphanidea whittalii, my absolute top tulip. Impossible to describe in terms of colour, impossible to describe that gorgeous sort of olive green base inside, and so willing to stay with you. So there's rather a long answer, yes. I'm afraid.
Lovely. But you mentioned that we're very privileged to have you here today because it's such a long way that you've come, because you're in Dorset, you've got a lovely garden there that we need to talk a little bit more about. But Suffolk, quite a journey. So how do you feel about trekking across the country?
I feel fantastic. I feel it's incredible that you have come. I feel that, we all have to show that there is a life ahead, that we can do these things that we used to do. And yes, I am so thrilled that the people here at the Cut and Liz, whose idea it was, got together and made this happen. It's very easy to say, oh, well, we're locked up for another month, put everything on hold. No, we can still do things. We can. And, we're so much in a better position now with all this extraordinary jabbing that's gone on to do things than perhaps, many people elsewhere are. So, no, it's wonderful to come here. it's wonderful to come to the first event that I've given for, where I've been invited for about 18 months, and wonderful to come to Suffolk because we have a family here, we have a daughter, and we have 4 staggeringly handsome grandsons. I mean, who wouldn't come?
But until that point, East Anglia wasn't such a familiar place to you. I mean, I'm going to mention landscaping now because you do mention a visit to East Anglia and how it was quite difficult for you to appreciate initially?
I think if you've lived amongst mountains, my birthplace is Abergavenny, and there you have the Black Mountains, you have the Brecon Beacons. We led quite, I realise in retrospect, quite a wild childhood, with parents who very much believed in that Arthur Ransom dictum. I think it comes right at the beginning of Swallows and Amazons, actually, from memory. If duffers will drown. And there it is. That's not the modern way of parenting, I know, but my parents were very much, we were given very, very few rules, but they were very important. And so we grew up with respect for the environment, and you have to have great respect for the environment. Suddenly, if a mist came down on the mountains, we were told just to, lie down on the ground and wait for it to blow over, which it did. I mean, we didn't have to lie there all night. But simple things, just, things that as children you didn't have to really sort of think twice about. And also, of course, we didn't have the sea, which is the most dangerous thing of all. So,
and they were quite instrumental, your parents, in your love of gardening eventually. So it wasn't as a child that you appreciated gardening so much?
No, absolutely not. Both my parents, I mean, it's so much you only realise in retrospect. That's the sad thing, actually, that you don't realise the worth of your parents when they're actually there. And you can say, God, that really was such a great gift. Thank you very much. I had a mother who was a great amateur botanist, who could name every grass in every field that she walked through. And as a small child out walking, we walked a great deal. And I'm afraid it's something we inflicted on our children as well. And now I see that they walk their children a great deal. So there it is. But she used to take my hand and used to sort of, feel it round the stem of a plant and say, do you feel that? Do you feel how square it is? And I said, yes, it is. And she said, well, there's a whole gang of those things. She didn't say it in my language. She said it much more elegantly. But she taught me, that all these things had names, and it was worthwhile taking a little trouble to learn them. Yeah,
and
she was splendid. And we used to do these great sort of expeditions, real sort of pilgrimages to see things like the globe flowers, growing on the back of the sugarloaf. And my father was an equally good botanist, although zoology was his strength. And it was he who took me to see the first sundew, which is one of the 2 English sort of insect-eating plants. And things like this, were very imprinted on my mind, and the moss that they grew in, and the sorts of areas where you might find them. Yeah, and I was absolutely thrilled, when we were up in Scotland. We managed a wonderful, a little 5-day escape up onto Colonsay to find, these sundew growing all over the tops there. And I thought, gosh, sundew, I always thought you were rare.
And your mother taught you the Latin names for things
she did.
When you were tiny?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and forced me to do A-level Latin.
You've never looked back.
Now, of course, once one understands how much Latin has actually fed into all the Romance languages with which we're most familiar, and particularly into English, I say, thank you, Ma. Wherever you are, that was the source of some bitter arguments at the time, and I hated it, but I'm glad now.
And then you started a career in the BBC.
Yes.
But when was it that you discovered this passion yourself for gardening, do you think?
Oh, when you settle. I think, you have that time in your 20s when you're just, on the rampage, aren't you? That's what the 20s are for. They're not for settling and gardening, for heaven's sake. A few people get it. And fortunately, it's very fortunate they do, that people come in and do apprenticeships, and, that much more now is being made of actually offering apprenticeships and training places for young people. Because for too long, it was offered as a thing that you perhaps could do if you weren't particularly good at, English or maths. And that was so wrong. It's a very complex subject. You need to be an artist. You need to be a scientist. You need to have very good powers of observation. I think actually, learning to look, that was the thing that Christopher taught me. Oh, boy, did he teach it. At the beginning, when I first met him, because I was trying to lure him into the Observer as our gardening correspondent, and I was invited down to Dixter, and we did the classic walk up the long border. And of course, at that stage, I hadn't been gardening very long, and I didn't know all that much, the names of things. And I'd ask the name of something, and he would say, write it down. And I said, I don't have a notebook. And he said, well, don't ask me again then. So he was very, very fierce, and quite rightly. I never, ever went anywhere without a notebook after that. It's really what you need to do, because you won't remember. You think you will, but you won't. Yeah. No, it did take a while, and of course when you're young, gardening, tedious. Your parents always bottom up in the borders, always tending lupins and things. When you want to be down, you know, at the pavilion or the Colosseum watching the latest film. So I think it happens when you get settled. Mm.
So your first home, though, was a houseboat? Was it a houseboat or a boat?
Oh, no, not allowed
No,
to call it a houseboat. No, head off, my husband would say. Off with the head. No, it was a Thames sailing barge, a very handsome creature. And it was lovely. Sort of thing you could do in the 60s, somehow. We had to get a marine mortgage to do it. A Lloyd's mortgage at 25%, imagine. And yet we thought, no, definitely worthwhile. And yet my mother did very sweetly arrive with wild iris, flag iris and snowdrops, and even a cutting of a sort of Rambler Rosie thing. And she planted them all very, very carefully and sweetly. But, you know, the following spring, after a winter, the flag iris had disappeared down in the winter floods, and the snowdrops were all picked by people coming for walks along the towpath, and the Rambler Rose was eaten by a horse in the neighbouring paddock. So that was sort of slightly the end of our gardening. Because pots on deck, no. That's what houseboats do. Yes. But this was a really fantastic 80-foot Thames sailing barge called Falconet, yeah.
And you had quite a few adventures on there, I mean, particularly with a small child, so you had to...
Oh, yes, yeah. She actually survived with one of those things that have slightly, I think, come back into fashion. It was a leather harness that I had been put into as a child, and then you had a rein attached to it. And we still had it knocking about. So my husband very carefully measured the length from the mainmast to the edge of the sailing barge, and actually tied one end to the mast, tied the other end to the harness, and said, well, that's fine. So that was our safety measure, because he wouldn't have anything like, you know, chicken wire put up on the edges. No, it was, it had to remain pristine.
And you mentioned about having a mentor for your gardening, and also the influence of your parents. But your next home was in West Sussex, and you had quite an influential neighbour who had advice.
You've done brilliant research. You don't often get somebody who's so well versed in your own background. Yeah. That was interesting, of course, because most people in the olden days used to perhaps not move very far from where they were born. You know, you married local people, you sort of settled somewhere quite close by. And so, of course, that wonderful knowledge kept coming in from your mother and your father. And our generation didn't do that so much. We went to London to work. I worked at the BBC. And then when that became no longer possible because of, you know, another child, we went down to a little village near Petworth. It was called Curdford. And we settled in a cottage there with a very sweet cottage garden. I was very lucky in being, as it were, given this thing on a plate, which was not problematical. But I knew very little. And I went out one day with a fork, determined to clear a little side border at the side of the house. And I was just about to plunge the fork into the soil when a window flew open in our neighbour's cottage, and this amazing stentorian voice shouted out, "Don't touch that border!" So I thought, "Ooh, crumbs, doesn't it belong to us?" Ooh. And this woman came marching around, fantastic woman called Jo Schwarby, never married, but one of those women who used to exist then in all villages, who did everything, who knew everything, who were splendid at everything that they turned their hands to, jam making, gardening, running this, running that. Fantastic woman, Jo Schwarby. And she came and gave me my first gardening lesson in this particular garden, next to which she had lived for 30 years and which she knew intimately. And that border contained Madonna lilies. And she said, "You have no idea how difficult it is to establish a border of Madonna lilies." And I said, "No, I don't." So she taught me so much. She was magnificent and very sweet to the children. She had no children of her own. There was a generation of magnificent women whose to-be husbands perhaps were lost in the First World War. And that's, in a curious way, you know, happened to a certain extent after the Second, but not in any way to the great extent it did after the First. And gosh, they were a memorable tribe. So yes, I owe her a lot. And also I owe a lot to the first thing my parents sent me, which was Hillier's Manual of Trees and Shrubs, which existed at home in its own green paper cover, and which was marked, with ticks and very sad crosses, where something that my parents had ordered had actually died. But that was a Bible for them. But what I hadn't quite realised, that they, in Abergavenny, in Wales, were gardening on an acid soil, and so Hillier's Manual of Trees and Shrubs suited them perfectly, full of marvellous rhododendrons, acers, all sorts of acid-loving plants. And I was in West Sussex on pretty solid potting clay. And so many of the Hillier things just weren't my sort of plant, but it took a while and some sad deaths before actually I realised that. And it was another Christopher dictum. Never kill a thing more than 3 times. It is so unfair on the plant. And it's so true. It is so true. It is our own selfishness, our own desires to dominate our gardens that actually is at fault. We need to accept what is possible, delight in what is possible, and find out what likes you and grow a lot of it. That is my rule for growing old. I've done plenty of the other, I can tell you, yeah. But now, all sorts of things aren't quite the same as they used to be, and you do have to make adjustments. That's one of them.
So you moved from Sussex to Dorset. Why was that? What did you find there?
Lunatic, difficult to explain, and very irresponsible, as indeed purchasing a barge at a 25% Lloyd's mortgage was. But somehow it's been the train of our lives. My husband, is never afraid of some of the mad ideas that we've had. He's never afraid of them. And he never puts the sensible point of view. And that's his great strength. And sometimes one could do with a sensible point of view, it has to be said. But the fact that he's up for anything, and if I suddenly suggested that we ought to go to Eastern Turkey, he knew perfectly well that the PKK was at maximum activity, but he never said, look, what about the PKK? He doesn't ever do that. So I began to feel that in West Sussex, we did not have the capability to sustain a life with then 2 children because one forgets how bad the 70s were, how things suddenly disappeared, how suddenly the whole oil situation became impossible, how suddenly you couldn't get bread. The 3-day week, the whole thing became really sort of quite extraordinary. And until Andy Marr covered it again in his magnificent television series, I'd forgotten just what it was like. But I said to my husband, we need to be somewhere where we have a constant supply of firewood and where I can grow enough to feed us and have enough to barter. And he said, where do you think? And I said, well, I think West Dorset, partly because I had an aunt there, my maddest aunt. My mother was one of 12 children, so I had mad aunts scattered all over the place, but this was a particularly mad one and a very, very good one. And I knew she would welcome the idea with her usual enthusiasm, and she would have some ideas about where we ought to go. And one of her ideas, because she is mad, was this totally ramshackle rectory with a roof that was fallen in, not a single habitable room, and we couldn't even get in to see it because it was so overgrown. And she said, this, she said, I think would be perfect. So, yeah, it was in the long run. We gave ourselves 15 years to actually try and knock it into shape, because of course we didn't have any money, because you had all these children eating stuff. One of them sitting over there. I mustn't be rude about the kids who have been magnificent. But it wasn't exactly what we would call, the ideal place to move with 2 young children and a third on the way. But, God, it was in a staggering house in the end. And it possessed us entirely, And it had the most weird thing in the garden, because it took us 18 months even to find where our boundaries were. We couldn't get a removal van in. We had to stack all the furniture in a very leaky shed. Not that we had much. And it was impossible in every respect. But it did eventually absolutely rule our lives. And 2 of the girls were married from there. And it had a way of showing you the way, so that you didn't actually impose your own self on it. You somehow were led to where the path should be, and you'd stick your fork or your spade in, and there would be the cinders of a path, and all you had to do was follow it. And all you had to do was just let the place emerge from these really, probably, more than 100 years of neglect. And there was the garden. And it took a long time to do that, a long, long time. And I became obsessed with the kitchen garden because of this thing of growing food. And that really stopped me from ever exploring very much of the else of the garden. But the kitchen garden, I always imagined somehow, I wanted people to walk in and think it had always been like this. Well, in a sense, it had once been like that. The paths were in the right place. It was the original 17th century divisions. And so I grew every single fruit and vegetable that could be grown outside. And it took a lot of effort. I mean, kitchen gardens do, as Tilly is now finding at Glenman, where she has the most splendid kitchen garden. But it's a lot of work, very time-consuming. But we did it, and I was, that was somehow the vision that I'd always had for that place. But the 2 days that the two young, older daughters walked up the lane to the church and were married from that place, I thought that's an apotheosis of that house. It has seen them through from babies to this point. And so it sort of had a natural end, but I just knew we could not sustain that place into our old age. There were endless roofs that were falling down, endless walls falling down, and so we just had to sort of face the fact of going, but we had a long time to face it. That was our luck. We gradually got used to the idea that we were not going to actually die in this place, we were going to move. And we had the enormous good fortune to actually find the place we wanted to go before we sold the rectory. And so we had our hearts already half moved away from the place before we actually left. The leaving point was very difficult. And somebody at the Indie, where I did a column for 30 years, said, when are you going to write about that? It obviously meant a lot to you. And I said, not yet. And there was just a day when I walked into the hut where I always wrote my column on a Friday. And I sat down, and in floods of tears, I wrote about that move. And it was extraordinary. It was several months after, before I could actually face it and see what it meant. And then, in a curious way, the new place has been so different, so totally absorbing, a different soil. For all those years in Pennygate and also at the rectory, I gardened on clay. And suddenly, although I didn't know it, in this new place we had this soil called green sand, which is just on the acid point of neutral. And I can grow all sorts of things I could never grow before on the clay. Magnolias have become an obsession. I could grow rhododendrons if I wanted. I could grow camellias, all sorts of stuff that I knew required a different sort of soil. I'm able suddenly to grow. And so we've made a completely different sort of garden, absolutely from scratch, because there was nothing telling you what to do there. This had been a small farm, and farmers don't have an awful lot of time to garden, so there was probably a veg patch somewhere, but it was mostly wild when we got there. And we've been there 18 years now, but I still talk about it as the new garden. And it has been the most wonderful treat to be able to move off in an entirely different direction and make a garden which has been the most enormous exploration and joy for me, and which is situated in a place where, quite honestly, still, I turn my back on the garden, which is on a steep slope, with a valley rising up the other side, looking out over the valley, watching the rooks fly, and that is still the most important thing about that garden to me, is not what I've put into it, but what I can see from it. And that is something, of course, that is given to you, and which is the most incredible gift, is to be able to look out from the place where you live with your feet on your own little patch of soil and look at all this extraordinary beauty. And it was actually a very pertinent understanding of that made me write my last book, Landscaping, and that love of landscape and that understanding of its importance in my life, which of course was stitched in from the time that I was a child, growing up amongst all these lovely hills and mountains, the Brecon Beacons and the Black Mountains. Yeah, so it's wonderful to have had the chance, at quite a late stage in one's life, to have made another garden, which one really loves. And actually, when I look back, I think is a more sustaining, fulfilling garden than the one we left behind at the rectory, even though we were at the rectory for so long. But so much of my time there was tied up with those fruit and those veg and those espaliers and those fans and those figs and those peaches that never quite worked. So there we go.
And I've got many, many more questions, but I'm just conscious that we're running out of time. So if anybody's got a question that they'd like to ask Anna, if you'd like to shout it, I'm afraid we haven't got a microphone, but do feel free to shout. I'm just, yes. In front.
Do you ever get overwhelmed going into the garden? I've got my garden on sand, and I grow things that should grow on sand, but I can also do roses and things like that. But at the moment, the weather has been so extreme. And I'm battling away, and I'm thinking, I'm just battling.
I know.
Nothing else.
I know. Actually, I don't know whether it'll be of a sort of help to you, but I think a great many gardeners are feeling exactly the same. And it's nothing to do with age. I was on the phone to the middle daughter, who, like the youngest one, is a great gardener. And she was saying, she said, I can't bear the thought I've got to do this all again next year. and she's actually a very good gardener. But I think there are these times of the year, and I think late May and June are absolutely it, where everything is surging, you can't keep on top of the weeds, vast great growths of roses and all sorts of other things are flapping you in the face, and it all seems too much. But we hang on to the fact that by August it will be slowing down. When we cut things down, they will stay down. And then we will catch up during the best gardening months, which for me are September and October. The light then is absolutely wonderful. You do have a sense of actually finding some order, of actually understanding which things are becoming a little bit too dominant, which really need attention. You can give them that attention. It's actually, not a brilliant time for pruning always, but you can actually get in your mind firmly fixed that in February I'm coming back to that thing, and I'm doing that and that and that. And you can come to terms with your garden again, because it's not galloping away from you the whole time. I think it's a very natural feeling. And Tilly, and I were wandering in her garden yesterday, and she's got a 2-acre kitchen garden. I mean, it is just absolutely phenomenal, staggeringly beautiful. But she was going, the weeds, look at that, I only hoed that yesterday. And I said, Tills, it's just the time of the year. You have done brilliantly even to get this amount of order in, because they've only been there 2 years, switched houses within the family. And I think it is just that sense that also partly our natures, if we are people who like order, then there are times when our gardens actually just say, oh, boo to you, I've got my own ideas. And, you do learn too that we come to a sort of accommodation, that we have enough order to please us, but also enough freedom and self-seeding, which I'm very prone to. It's so much easier than raising things yourself. I love self-seeders. And I think we come to an accommodation of how much leeway the garden will take for itself and how much we just want to keep the paths open, keep views open. So, don't despair. I think it is a very, very widely held feeling at this time because, as you say, the conditions, which in Britain every year is different, but this year they have been very overwhelming.
And how much help do you have? Because you don't have very much help in your garden.
No, but the help I have is brilliant. I have 4 hours a week. And I could not manage without those 4 hours. It comes on a Thursday morning, and he turns up at 7:30 in the morning with his truck and his dog. Have you ever had anybody working for you that doesn't have a truck and a dog? The dog seems to be sort of, as it were, part of the truck. Anyway, he is a farmer's son. He is a brilliant worker, fantastic at just the physical labouring, trenches and things like that. But mostly what he's engaged in is stuff that I don't do, which is machinery. He strims, he clips, he does things with hedge trimmers. He goes up to the top of ladders now and ties in roses. I don't like being at the top of ladders anymore. My balance isn't what it was. So Tim is absolutely essential. And although he's not a trained gardener, he's got incredible sort of work ethic and incredible ability just to keep going for those 4 hours. I don't know how he does it. He was digging trenches so deep because we were actually shoring up the last of the banks. With the trench hand dug, had no machinery with him, was so deep that all I could see was his shoulders and head. And he'd done all that by hand. I mean, to me, it's quite staggering. Quite staggering. So he is essential. And I do think, if I'd thought about it, I wouldn't have actually built in so much clipping into the garden. There's a lot to be clipped. But I love the tall yew pillars. I love the rounded yew balls. And we have created a sort of monument at the top of the garden, which requires very careful clipping. And he does that. He gets it. He loves it. And, if there's something he doesn't know, he takes a photograph of it. And then, he puts the name underneath. He shows really interest in what we've got and what we're doing. Yeah. So, hooray for the Tims of this world.
Thank you. Any more questions? I can't see, but at the back, yeah.
Oh, hi. Well, I was wondering, what do you think about the transferry wilding now?
Yeah.
Gardens go a little bit wild and loose.
Some can do it. And in some places, I think it's a very, very good thing. We've got a lot of long grass in our garden. And that's partly because of work we did at the beginning with the JCB, it was a very steep slope. And as I was sort of mountaineering my way up through the wilderness, our eldest daughter shouted up from the yard, "Perfect for your old age, Mama." And of course, so it is proving. So we did actually make it into a series of banks and terraces. And the long grass grows on the steep sloping, and then we mow the flats. And there's a lot that is wild, but we've got room to do that. I think it is very much more difficult to do it in a small garden, and very much more difficult to actually establish a really good wildflower sward than people think. Comes up beautifully, sown on bare earth the first year. The second year, less good. By the third year, you will be getting all the old enemies, the docks and the dandelions and the thistles coming in. They're difficult things to do well. And if you've got, as we've got, unimproved grassland, you don't feel the same need to actually make that, because beyond the stream at the bottom of the valley, there rises up a hill, which is our fields. It's 20 acres of unimproved pasture. So, there's 113 wild plants in one of them, which the government calls an SNCI, and a man comes to count them every year with a clipboard, and I'm sitting there thinking, what can I do about it, apart from bring the sheep in, which fortunately we're able to do with a neighbour's sheep. But they're not easy. I think leaving lawns to grow wild is a very nice idea. But then you see, I love speedwell, I love daisies, I think they're enchanting, so I'm very glad to have those anyway. And I think there's often places where you can leave the grass just to sort of do its own thing amongst whatever wildflowers might bring themselves in. And it's really interesting what will happen. There was a little paddock below us which belonged to the place we bought called Foxpatch, and it was always mown flat because the people who lived there had sons who were great cricketers, so there were nets and they practiced their bowling and batting. So mown flat for more than 20 years. And I decided, we'd plant it as an orchard with old West Country varieties of trees. Apples. And so we let the grass grow, and I was going to use it as a hay meadow, cut it, in September. And the first year we did that. Second year, an orchid appeared. And then after several years of this, 60 orchids. And they'd all been sitting there with their heads being mown off every year and saying to themselves, our time will come. And so it did. So often it's just a matter of letting the place grow. And it is infinitely easier to create a wildflower look, letting stuff grow, than it is to start it from seed. And when you start it from seed, you will almost always have that oxeye daisy in it. And I know people think that lovely long shots of oxeye daisies are beautiful. That is not a wildflower meadow. They are bullies. They are absolute bullies. If what you want is a real mix, they will not allow it, because they are so, galloping of space and seeding everywhere. So if you just let things grow, and then if you plug in things like, for instance, that wild, beautiful geranium which grows in the verges up in the Cotswolds on that chalky soil, that's a beautiful plant for long grass. That blue is so gorgeous. Anything with pratense as its Latin suffix will be good in long grass. Pratense means meadow. So anything that you find in your plant finder with pratense is worth trying as a plug in a meadow. And that's an easier way to make a wildflower mix than scalping off the topsoil, sowing seed. It's difficult to establish a good one that way. But I love long grass, and this year it's astonishing. The long grass is so high, and the grass seed heads are so wonderful. Then comes, we haven't had the rain yet, but as Tilly was noticing in her garden, of course the whole lot then just collapses. Wildflower meadows are great up to the middle of June. After that, they're a mess, and then you just can't wait to cut them, but you can't do that until they've shed the seed, and that's really not until about September. So, there are downsides, but those are never the ones that gardening correspondents talk about. Yeah, and yes, good for wildlife, but so are garden plants, as the RHS experiment showed. The bees and all the other creatures that actually depend on flowers in one way or another, they go to the garden plants as much as they do the wild ones. So, we mustn't be sort of difficult about this. A lot of flowers are very, very good for pollinating insects. The thing, actually, that the bumblebees in our garden recently have been using, above all else, are the gorgeous allium with the floppy heads. It used to be called Nectaroscordon. I think it is now an allium again. But it's that lovely sort of rather strange buffy pinky thing, quite tall with those hanging heads, and then it turns upwards like a candelabra when it goes to seed. Bumblebees absolutely swarming over that. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we have reached our time, unless anybody's got something really pressing to ask. And then we might actually, you'll be in the foyer afterwards, won't you?
Yes.
So we'll be able to chat further there.
Yeah.
But can I just conclude by finding out what you're working on at the moment? So obviously the garden, you're still
Yes.
very active there, but what are you writing at the moment?
Well, actually, it's not a new book, because I really felt that landscaping was a sort of apogee for me. There's a lot of personal stuff in that, which, somehow, it was a very, sort of meant a lot to me, that book. But actually, it was Phaidon, who, a publisher, well, I think art books is what people think of them as, but they are very good at, production. I'd worked as a consultant editor on a book of theirs, and then they got in touch and said, well, they were thinking perhaps a reprint of one of my old books called Plant Partners might be worth doing. It would require, we've actually rethought it a great deal, and it doesn't bear very much resemblance to the original anymore, because I worked on it all through the winter, and it's been really interesting. But I wouldn't call that, as exciting as a whole completely new book. But it's coming out spring 22. That's right, that's next year.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're at the moment, and I'm working, which for me is quite a difficult process, working online, trying to get a book together. And of course, I'm used to being with Liz and all the gang at Bloomsbury round a table arguing, things being thrown in front of you. What do you think of this? What do you think? Because, they're so incredibly generous at Bloomsbury. My experience there has spoilt me, really, for working anywhere else at all. Asking your opinion about things. A lot of writers don't even get a say in anything like that. But it was wonderful, and I loved those processes, Liz, those making of a book. It's so incredibly exciting. The typefaces and the design and the wide margins. And, I've got a bit of a thing about wide margins in a book. And it's just lovely to see the thing physically coming together in this package. And very difficult to do, especially with revolting broadband such as we've got, trying to do everything in PDFs and online. So I'm finding that pretty exhausting, actually. But of course, all of you who've Zoomed before, this is my first Zoom. I said no to any Zooming, because I knew we couldn't do it from home. My kit is so old, I don't even have a camera in my screen. And we have terrible broadband. So, the whole process of making the book isn't what I remember from the lovely times we had at, and you had Will Webb, who was absolutely top designer. God, he was good. Yeah, so it was a cream time.
Well, all the books, well, a number of the books, actually, we haven't got all of your books because you've written so many, but a number of the books are outside, so hopefully we can all have a jolly good browse again at those. But thank you so much for spending the time and travelling out here to be with us, because it has been such a treat. It's been wonderful. Your enthusiasm is so infectious. So thank you so much, and thank you all for coming and listening, and that's it for today. So goodbye and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.